final macro seminar series session for 2012-13. My name is Anna Haley-Locke. This is all old information for most of you here, but I just wanted to give a quick context to what this series is, its purposes, and history and intended future. It was started by a second-year student 3 years ago who was very interested in macro content and wanted to create some kind of structure to provide co-curricular additional learning around macro issues, so macro being policy, organization, community level practice. And so be able to expose students and have them extend beyond their classroom learning to more issues around macro practice by bringing folks in, great impressive speakers who are engaged in macro practice in the community. So with the help of a generous donation from an alum of our program, we were able to get it started. So this is the third year. We've had a range of speakers and types of events. So we meet with people in brown bags to get a sense of what they do in the field and how they got to where they are from social work and how they view what they do as key social work practice. We've had some evening events, sort of kind of a range of formats and content. It sounds like from what we hear from students and community members and faculty that it's achieved its goals of kind of broadening as well as deepening the content we have at the school around macro issues. So we're delighted to keep doing it. We're hoping to raise a little more funding, but also continue to bring in connections from the community to the school around macro issues and welcome student input and alum input all along the way in that process. So thanks for being here. I will hand it over to our esteemed speaker, Roberta Gassman, who has an incredible range of experience locally, nationally, across the macro spectrum, is an alum of ours, also an instructor of ours and a current fellow. We are just delighted to have you talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's great to see all of you. It's great to be here. For those of you that just snuck in, just kind of the breadth of who's here, Mona Wasow was one of my two field instructors the first year I was here when I started my MSSW, and I started in 70 and finished in 72, and so isn't that great? And then to see Mel, who's been a wonderful friend and colleague, and to see all of you. And LaToya, it's great to see you. LaToya and I have become buddies, and it's been wonderful to get to know you and learn about you and have great hopes for you in your future. Just to help me, how many of you are first years? And so the rest of you are second years. There aren't any undergraduates here? No.
But
and
some graduates, right?
Some part-time, like I'm
part-time. Okay, great. And how many of you were in Catherine Magnuson's class when I spoke? Okay, so some of you just actually heard me this week, and for that class I used a PowerPoint, and I thought there might be some of you here, and Anna had told me this is more conversational, so I'm not going to do PowerPoint, and I thought we'd have a conversation, but it helps me to know that you did hear me. You'll hear some of my stories, but I'll frame them a little differently. So let me share with you what I wanted to talk about. First, I wanted to talk about why does macro matter? As an old MSSW myself. And then I wanted to share with you, Anna asked me to talk about my career story and kind of how did my career happen and what were the steps. And for me, that's about the jobs that I had, but also the volunteer work that I had, because the volunteer work that I had meshed with my personal interests, and that ended up opening doors for me in my career. And I wanted to share that with you because I think that's an important lesson. I wanted to share with you some of the lessons learned from my work at the state level, the city level, the county level, the federal level, and the private sector, because I've had the really great, rich opportunity to work in all those levels. And then I wanted to talk just a bit about some of the skills that I think are important as those of you who are already working in the field, but those of you who are going to be going off and becoming our change agents of the future. Whether you're micro social workers, I would argue macro social work matters, and I think it can make for stronger macro social workers, and some of you might go into macro social work yourselves, and obviously it's important there. So let me just talk about why it matters. And, you know, forgive me if you've covered some of this in the classes you've had, but it shows that our ideas are reinforcing other ideas. And those of you, by the way, who haven't signed up for my class yet for the fall, with that July sign up ahead, I hope you'll consider it. I would love to have you. I think we've got about 15 students so far. Any of you in this room signed up for it? Oh, good. Great, great, excellent. 869, I think. I should know that. Is that right? Whew, I got that. All right, good. So I want to go to, just for a minute, the preamble of our occupation that NASW puts out, just to kind of anchor this and remind us about why macro matters. In 2008, the NASW Delegate Assembly revised the Code of Ethics. That's, you know, it's pretty chubby. It's 18 pages long, and the preamble that's in there, how many of you know it or have looked at it? Most of you looked at it. I'm just going to kind of reiterate it because I think it's the foundation of why this is important. The primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. It goes on to say, fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. And it basically calls upon us to work to promote social justice and social change with and on behalf of clients. I'm skipping parts of this, but it goes on to say that advocacy, social and political action, and policy development and implementation, and education, research, and evaluation are all important to the people that we serve. And before I get to tell you my personal story, which I will, I'm a news junkie. I've kind of always been a news junkie, and because I'm 64 years old, I'm still attached to like print, and I like to hold the newspapers in my hand. I like to see how big is the headline, where was the story on the page, how does it look compared to other stories? And even though I go online to check the news also, I still, I get the New York Times every day, I get the State Journal every day, I get the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel every day. When I was in Washington, I got the Washington Post every day. I will say I encourage all of you as social workers to really follow and be engaged in the world and be engaged in the news, because if you think of that code of ethics and the people we're here to serve and that we care about, the world of politics, the world of elected officials and agencies, that work is covered in our press, and it is tied and key to what we do. And the more we know about what's going on in that world, the better and more effective we can be in our jobs. So just yesterday, there were 2 stories. Anyone here read the State Journal? Part of your... Okay, so yesterday, 2 stories right out of the State Journal. And this, of course, was not just in the State Journal. It's been all over the press. A new report that came out. This isn't a surprise to those of us who've been following these issues, but it really matters to us given the people that we care about, the clients that we're here to serve. The richest got 10% richer. The wealth distribution in our country has been continuing the trend that's really been going on since the 70s, where we've seen the wealthier get wealthier and wealthier, and we've seen stagnation in the middle, and we've seen the lower income folks, the most vulnerable, their incomes are not keeping up. And so this polarization within our country, within our states, within our communities, is, I would argue, not a good thing. And it threatens and impacts the people. If you think about who does social work serve, the vulnerable, the mentally ill, the disabled, the low income, people with aorta issues, all of those populations, when we see big income distributions, are vulnerable. When we see, and there's stories in the paper every day, CEOs of companies, this is going on right now at Caterpillar in Milwaukee, a major multinational business, as mining, they build big pieces of equipment, as mining around the world goes down, Caterpillar's business is going down. They are bringing their employees to the table, working to not have salaries go up, but the CEOs of not just Caterpillar, but many other businesses are getting multi-million dollar bonus packages and salary packages. I just bring this up because it impacts the people that social work is there to serve. Also in the paper yesterday, this story, Ben Affleck, famous movie star, right? Producer, director, just made the Argo, the movie of the year. Did we see each other there? We saw each other seeing Argo at Sundance. Ben Affleck, because of concern about the poor, is saying he's going to live below the line. He's going to join the national campaign, in his case focusing on global poverty and trying to live on the challenges of what people who are low income truly have to struggle with every day. And so he's joining this national movement. In our very own state, there's an organization, and you can go online to read about it, Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice. And they have a call out right now, and many people have joined it, to try to take the challenge to live on what is a food stamp budget and see what it is like to shop and cook within the amount of money that a low-income family would have to deal with. So I tell you this because macro happens within this context of what's happening in the news, what's happening in the world, what's happening in states. If you go and look at North Carolina, just last month, they approved steep cuts, and this is happening all over the country, to unemployment insurance. This is a state with very high unemployment. North Carolina, they were leaders for years in furniture making, in tobacco, and in textiles. And all of those industries have been hit. They have many people on unemployment, particularly as the recession got severe starting in 2008 and really into 2009. And here they are right now proposing a 35% drop in the level of benefits, cutting weeks to between 12 and 20 weeks when the weeks had been 26. This is the context that we as social workers have to care about, because if you go even into micro practice, you're going to be working probably with people who are underemployed or unemployed and maybe on benefits. So what happens given these kinds of issues? Well, we have the executive branch of our country, we have the legislative branch, and we have the courts, the judicial branch. And this is at the federal level and in the state level as well. So at the federal level, our CEO is our president, elected by the people. A CEO puts forward a vision as they run for office, a president does. Obama certainly did, and presidents before him did. And then when they're elected, they put their budget together that is an extension of their views. And they lay out each year a State of the Union address. And that State of the Union usually highlights what's going to be coming out in their budget. Did any of you watch President Obama's State of the Union in February? Anyone watch it? Okay, so let's just think about, if we talk about these vulnerable populations that our preamble and our code of ethics calls for us to care about, our president put forward raising the minimum wage, which hasn't been done for many years, which certainly helps when you're living on minimum wage, low wage workers. It's very hard. You are living in poverty when you're on the minimum wage, when you're living at minimum wage level. So he called for raising the minimum wage. He called for 4-year-old kindergarten, right? That we should have a universal 4-year-old kindergarten. He called for providing Americans the skills they need for jobs, good paying jobs, so that they can help our economy, but they can best support themselves and their families. So I would argue these are all issues that social workers have to care about, because if kids don't have good early education, what happens to them by the time they get to even 3rd grade? They're going to be behind. And then you can track it. They're going to be further behind by high school. And then you can further track it. There have been studies that have been done, and actually the president studied the most famous study that Nobel laureate Heckman and former professor here actually worked on. He's at Minnesota now. Child care professor, a social work professor who focused on childcare, but the president talked about the famous study that for every dollar you invest in early childhood education, it pays itself back sevenfold. He talked about this in his address. Nobel laureate, University of Chicago economist Heckman has taken this on as an issue because he believes if you're going to help our country long term and have us have skilled workers, you got to get at poverty, and the best time to get at poverty is to address it when kids are young, because if you get them in early childhood education, they're going to do better over their lifetimes. And you can track that graduates of quality childcare not only have a higher rate of graduating from high school, they do better when they go into the workforce, and they're better able to support themselves, and they're less likely to live in poverty. So an executive lays out an agenda in a budget and in a State of the Union, and then of course we have Congress, or in our state we have a governor and the legislature, and then you have mayors and city councils. So it happens at all the levels, but I'm just kind of giving you some examples. And we have a fight going on in our country right now over what is the role of government. And what should we be doing? If we have, because of the recession, earnings have gone down, profits have gone down, and deficits, because of different decisions that have been made, if we have a deficit, there are some who feel, okay, the solution should just be cutting the deficit. There are others who feel, and the president put this agenda forward, yes, we have to do some trimming to help us come out of these tough times, but we have to invest at the same time. Because if we don't invest, the long-term stability of our country will be impacted. And when our leaders in Washington haven't been able to come to agreements on the budget, which they've not yet, and we have sequestration, which has gone into effect, and the big talk this week, of course, with sequestration is as you furlough federal employees, which you have to do to come up with across-the-board 8% cuts in every single federal agency, which is what sequestration put into effect. The air traffic controllers, okay, they're being furloughed, as all federal employees are, and as they're furloughed, what happens at airports? You have fewer air traffic controllers showing up each day, and then what happens to flights? There are delays. And so right now the public's going crazy, and apparently according to the morning papers, the president's even considering exempting air traffic controllers from the sequestration. We'll see where that goes. But I'm sharing this with you because this is the context in which we operate. Now, I would argue that micro-social work is obviously, all social work is important, and micro-social work is really important if we're going to help families and individuals cope with these issues and try to overcome them, access the services they're eligible for, get the supports they need, get the training they need, have a better life. That is all incredibly important. Try to escape poverty. I would argue that micro-social workers, if micro-social workers spend some of your time doing advocacy work, giving your clients a voice, helping your clients to have a voice, helping them to testify and write letters and speak to legislators, that can make a difference. And you as social workers can do that as well if you are micro-social workers, because it will have an impact on the clients that you care about. And if you decide to go into policy work where you're working in administration or being the thinkers, the researchers, working at kind of the policy level in government, obviously it's the basis of what you do. How many of you went to NASW's lobby day last week? I thought that was terrific. I thought that Nancy Amadei, the speaker, and I don't know if you knew her at Washington, because Anna got her PhD at the University of Washington. Nancy Amadei was a fellow Deputy Assistant Secretary. She was for President Carter in HNSS, and I was just most recently for President Obama at the Department of Labor. But we're DAS's, Deputy Assistant Secretaries. She was a DAS under Carter, and then she went, when finishing that work, home, or I don't know if it was her home, but she went back to the state of Washington, and she's just retired from the faculty, but she does a lot of speaking and advocacy work, and her work is on how to prepare people and social workers to impact lawmakers to try to pass laws and make improvements in the programs we care about that will impact the clients that we work for. So a big message of Nancy's last week was advocacy matters. Impacting legislators matters. And there are ways to do it in which you can be most effective.
Did she tell the butter story?
She did tell the butter story. She went over it heavily. Butter, 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 butter. She went around and did the butter story. Yes, she did. But she was great. Now I want to comment on, before I get into my personal story and then share some lessons learned, how am I feeling right now as I look at this climate of there is partisan bickering, there are two different views of the world. Do we invest? Don't we invest? Do we only cut? Are tax cuts the only answer? Can the wealthy take paying a little more in taxes to support some of the programs and investments that will bring about, I would argue, more equality and less vulnerability for social work clients? I would argue that. In spite of how challenging these times are, and I talked about this in my talk at Catherine Magnuson's class on Tuesday, I do feel optimistic, and for a couple of reasons I want to mention. One is young people. I think that young people just coming up always bring fresh ideas and energy and a certain tolerance to the table. If you look at some of the dramatic changes we've seen in our country, even in the last 10 years, even in the last 5 years on issues of marriage equality, young people, whether they're Republicans or they're Democrats or they're independents or whatever, young people just say, yeah, this is just common sense. So when I see young people in the talk I've been giving in a few places, I showed LaToya's slide as just being an example of young people who give me hope, who make a commitment to going back to communities and trying to help young people to have a better life and using the experiences and opportunities that you have had to do that. So young people give me hope. And having more women in elective office gives me hope because women, I think we get socialized to listen. These are social work skills, by the way, and they're important. We get socialized to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person. We get socialized to not draw a line in the sand. And I think these are some of the kinds of skills that we need in our country and in our states and in our communities right now if we're not going to fight and scream and get polarized, but we're going to try and find common ground. And Barbara Mikulski, who is an MSSW, who is in the United States Senate. Here's a story about Senator Mikulski. Lawmakers practice the art of compromise. And they are working across the aisle to try to figure out, can we ease some of the sting of spending cuts? The New York Times, by the way, just last month had a top-fold story on women now holding more power in the Senate. And then lots of pictures showing some of these women in action. And that does give me hope. Frankly, seeing more social workers in office would give me hope. Right now, Barbara Mikulski is not the only MSSW in Congress. There are, I think, 7 or 8, and Barbara Lee's one of them. There have been some in the past. If some of you would choose to run for office, whether it's local and then state and maybe national, you could be in Washington part of making a difference. So that's kind of me setting the stage for a little on why I think macro social work is important. Whether you choose it as your path or whether you choose micro, it is still important to impact the policies, the systems, the organizations that affect the people that we care about. So let me just talk about my personal story and see if this gives you some lessons. I do want to say that for me, being 64 years old and a child of the 60s, you know, to some of you, that's like, oh, the olden days, but not to some of us. But I'm very much a product of the 60s and the values that were a part of the culture of the 60s that were, for me, really sparked by the civil rights movement. Good luck. But before I talk about that, I want to tell you that I am the grandchild of immigrants who came to this country with nothing, with absolutely nothing. And they had to come to this country if they were going to survive, and they came to this country on one side of the family in the late 1800s, and on the other side of the family, pretty late relatively, about 1921, and they came escaping religious persecution in Eastern Europe and Russia. And I was very close to my maternal grandparents. I showed you a picture of them at my Magnuson class this week. My maternal grandmother stayed with us a lot when I was growing up. I was born in Boston. My grandparents immigrated to Boston, which has been very interesting the last 10 days, seeing what Boston is in the midst of. And actually, I lived in Dorchester, which is where the young boy who was killed lived in the bombing. But at any rate, I have a lot of affection for Boston. And my grandparents came to Boston. Modest means my one grandfather was a baker, the other became a tailor. At any rate, they came here escaping religious persecution. My grandmother, who stayed with us, she slept in my brother's bedroom, which was next door to my bedroom. This was in the 1950s. And every night, she woke up crying out for her mother. And I would hear this in my room. My brother did too, but for me it was just like really, really heavy, calling out for her mother. It's because her mother was killed in the Holocaust. And most of her family was killed. So my great-grandparents, all of those aunts and uncles and cousins were all killed and never made it out to this country. So this as a kid, how could this happen? How could religious persecution at this level happen? It just had this profound impact on me. And then growing up in the 50s and seeing news accounts of people being hosed down on streets and dogs going after people who were trying to integrate schools and restaurants and public facilities. This was really heavy. But it became real for me when we would go drive to Florida, where my Boston grandparents retired. Well, they actually still worked, but they went for better weather and cut back their hours. And we would pile in the station wagon. I was then living in Evanston, Illinois, and we'd pile in the station wagon and drive to the south, through the south to get to Florida. And I saw with my own eyes those signs above water fountains and outside bathrooms that said colored white. I saw this with my own eyeballs. And when you've seen something like that, given what I would hear my grandmother cry about, it just had this profound impact on me. And I tell you this because I was then drawn to a life of we had to care about any people being vulnerable or persecuted was not a good thing. And I became active as a high school kid in the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King became my hero. And I picked Wisconsin in part. I mean, one, my family could afford it because it was not a private school. And it had a culture then of activism, and it was close to where my family was. So I came here, and these were very turbulent times on campus here with the anti-war movement and the women's movement. I volunteered at, I knew about Jane Addams, who we think of as the mother of social work. And of course, she was not just she was a micro and macro social worker. And she did amazing things. And actually, Nancy Amadei talked about Jane Addams last week, and Nancy reminded us that, and I didn't know this actually, I might have read it, but I didn't remember that Jane Addams got elected to public office herself. She was on the elected school board. She was appointed by mayors and governors and presidents to policy-making bodies. So not only did she make Hull House, the settlement house, this center of better services for her people that she was serving, she knew she had to be engaged if she was really going to help these people, and she did that. So when I came here, I volunteered at Neighborhood House, which when it first started in Madison served immigrants and was in an old building and served the old Bush neighborhood by Park and Regent. Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, African-American immigrants who came to Madison all lived in the Bush. The building I ended up working in as a volunteer still stands. Anyone ever seen it at 29 South Mills? Yeah, it still stands. But when I was there, it was their then new building that was just built, I think, in the early 60s. So it had a big impact on me to do that volunteer work. When I got my master's, I did do microsocial work. I worked first with teens at Mendota, and I worked with the elderly. I was Independent Living's first social worker. And Independent Living has grown to become a huge, very successful agency. That was the very beginning of we should help elderly people stay in their own homes. We should give them support services so they can stay in their own homes. But meanwhile, and the part I want to tell you about is that in my personal life, I was active in politics in that I followed it, and I worked for people who I believed in, who I thought would make a difference, because I just cared about that. And I tell you this because it led me to ending up getting appointed to things in addition to having my paid job. And this ended up to me leading me to meet people and get asked to do things that opened other doors for me that, had it not been for that activism, I don't think would have happened. So I met Paul Soglin, who was the first time he was the mayor in the 70s, and he ended up appointing me to the Equal Opportunities Commission. And I ended up becoming the president of the Equal Opportunities Commission in Madison. This led me to getting asked to run citywide mayoral campaigns, which I first said, oh, I can't do that, I'm working, I have 2 little kids, but I did it. And out of that, I ended up meeting more people. After I did social work, I got hired by a nonprofit feminist organization, and we have till 1, correct? And I got hired by a nonprofit feminist organization which confronted the state agency I ended up being the secretary of. When I went there, it was called the Department of Workforce Development. In the 70s, it was called the Department of Industry, Labor, and Human Relations, DILR. And when unemployed people came to DILR, they got sent out to jobs. And women staged an action against DILR because women were getting sent out to low-paying jobs and men were getting sent out to higher-paying jobs. And when I saw that this nonprofit feminist organization out of an action got DILR to agree to hire these feminists to do training on women's issues all over the state of business leaders and the state employment workers at then DILR, I applied thinking running group sessions, women's issues, this would be putting together my political interests and my work. And I did that for 3 years. I ended up heading up that project, and out of this I learned the real legal basis of the women's movement. I learned the facts about the earnings gap, the facts about women in the workforce, the facts of what strategies would help. And I tell you this because sometimes you just kind of have to go for new opportunities. I didn't go do that because I thought it would open other doors. But then a fellow named Tony Earl was running for governor of the state of Wisconsin in the early 80s. And I was kind of known as a person who had expertise in women's employment issues, and a group of women's leaders who were putting together an agenda for this gubernatorial candidate asked me to write a paper on what he should do if he were elected governor on employment, on women's employment issues. So I wrote my paper, and then we all went to meet with that gubernatorial candidate. We sat around a table like this. People like Kay Clarenbach and Jean Boyer and Connie Trinan and Marion Thompson, kind of the old giants of the women's movement, and then little me in my 30s was at this table, and we all went around, and some people talked about entrepreneurship and some childcare and some domestic abuse and some displaced homemakers, and I talked about employment. We presented him with our papers, and he closed up the book. And at the end of it, he said, if I am elected, I will implement this whole agenda you've just given me. He won. And then I got asked to come into the governor's office and be his policy advisor on employment and women's issues, and it was my job to implement that agenda. So I tell you that because that opportunity opened up really out of some social work work, but a lot of volunteer and outside and putting together of those interests. I didn't know anything about lobbying the legislature. I didn't know anything about drafting state legislation. I didn't know really very much about state government, but I learned it. And in 4 years, we got a tremendous amount done. We raised the pay of men and women in female-dominated jobs by millions of dollars. We put more money into child care and domestic abuse and all those initiatives I mentioned to you before. From that, Paul Soglin came back again to be mayor. In the now we're talking 89, and he asked me to become his chief of staff. And I did that. And I hadn't really worked inside city government, but I thought, okay, I've done state government. I would like to learn about city government. And that led to me getting asked to become director of communications for the county, for the elected county executive. And the county has twice the budget of the city, and it has all of human services plus land use. So I thought, well, that would be a great thing to learn. And I learned in those 2 jobs over 8 years that partnerships and community building happen by different sectors working together. City government can't do it alone. County government can't do it alone. It's cities, counties, with philanthropy, with human services. How many of you have heard of the Schools of Hope program? Okay, so Schools of Hope right now, very successful. Volunteers help kids read. The reading scores of our kids have jumped dramatically since Schools of Hope, which is led by United Way. That grew out of a partnership of city government, county government, United Way, the newspapers, philanthropy, all coming together saying, we can't have this high achievement gap in Madison, and we've got to work together. So from that, very briefly, when my county executive decided not to run again for county executive, a president of a bank called me up and said, would you like to come and be our vice president for community investment? Because banks are required by law to show that they are investing in their community. So I learned about private sector, and this led to then Jim Doyle, who had been Attorney General for about 12 years, got elected governor in 2002 and came into office in 2003, and I got asked to join his cabinet as the secretary, the labor secretary, the Secretary of Workforce Development, which in a certain sense was putting together a lot of what I had learned in these jobs. And that was definitely macro social work, running the agency that I had been a part of the action against, some 20 years before. It's funny just how life works. And we very much at the Department of Workforce Development, we were working on career ladders. Did any of you go to Laura Dresser's talk? She spoke from cows. You went, and Laura's fabulous, fabulous. She's an MSSW before she got her PhD, and we brought in Laura all the time and had Laura and cows under contract to us, and we were working with a lot of Laura's thinking on career ladders and career pathways and what's the sweet spot between low-wage poor workers and having a middle-class life. It's very often technical community colleges where you can get your skills and move up a career ladder. So I just tell you that because this is where social workers were impacting state policy. We got the governor to put more funds in to fund programs to create pathways to higher wage work. Anyway, then Governor Doyle decided not to run for a 3rd term, and I was going to come here in 2011 to do what I'm going to be doing in the fall, teaching graduate students, and I got a phone call. I happened to be in Washington speaking at the time, and I was on my cell phone checking out of Whole Foods, and I'm checking out, you're putting things down and all the cash registers are going off and it's noisy, and it's the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Jane Oates, asking me if I wanted to come and be her deputy. And I said, oh, well, I can't, my husband's here, my life is here, I'm about to go to the School of Social Work. She said, well, will you think about it, even for a short-term commitment? And she gave me a few days to think about it, and I just decided, I've worked at the state level and city and county, how could I not do this? President Obama really believed in what I believed in and what an opportunity this would be. So I did it, and I went off. what I wanted to share about that is when I was Secretary of Labor here, I was active nationally. There's an organization of all my counterparts, and even people who aren't the secretaries but have other positions, and there's a National Association of State Workforce Agencies, and I became active in it, and I was chair of the Employment Committee, which was going on during the recession. So out of this I got, I mean, it was just active, and I knew people, and I got asked to testify before the United States Senate Finance Committee on the impact of unemployment on workers. And when I went to testify in Washington, this is when I was still secretary, there were 3 people testifying. Jane Oates, who was this assistant secretary, who called me when I was in Whole Foods on the cell phone, and me. So Jane was there representing the president, I was there representing the states, and then there was a private sector person. And a member of the Senate Finance Committee was coming after Assistant Secretary Oates, and he was saying, isn't it true that people are just staying on unemployment because they don't want to work? And isn't it true that unemployment benefits are just causing people to not want to really participate in the labor force? And I had been counseled on how to act before Senate congressional hearings, and I'd been told that after your opening remarks, don't just wait to be called on. If you have something to say, lean forward and just say it. And so when they came after her, I did speak up and spoke about what we learned in Wisconsin and how we saw that actually that was not true, and that people very much wanted to work, that we didn't have the jobs for them to fill, enough of those jobs. And so she and I got to bond just in this, 1-hour testimony before a Senate hearing. And I don't know if it was all from that, but opportunities come up from other opportunities. And I just wanted to share with you, when I got asked, did I want to go to Washington to testify, that was a little unnerving. I testified in Wisconsin before legislative hearings, but not before a Senate Finance Committee hearing. But that opened other doors. So I wanted to wrap up this little section just telling you that volunteer work matters, meeting people, getting to know people, finding people who can mentor you. I had people who I could get mentored by, and then staying active professionally. All of those steps can help you in any career, but they can really help you in a macro career. Lessons I've learned, and then what skills I think are important, and then see if we can have time for a question or two. I will say that from my volunteer work, lessons I've learned were many. I mean, even too many to mention. But I didn't go into these activities understanding or knowing how to manage large campaigns. I didn't go in knowing about media. I didn't know, as I told you, about how to draft and advance legislation. But I learned it, and I learned a lot of it wherever I could by just watching the masters do it. I sat in other campaigns and I watched people who were the communications directors, and I saw how they did it, and I saw how they communicated to the press and how brilliant they could be. Bill Christopherson, in particular, a person I worked under in multiple campaigns and worked with. And so that's really important. And finding mentors. Important mentor to me, the first director of that feminist nonprofit organization that got the contract to come in and do training for state and private sector managers to open doors for women. The director of that program was a great mentor to me. Working in the governor's office the first time, again, learning how to draft legislation, learning how to lobby, learning more about working with the media, because when you're in a governor's office, it's like a fishbowl, and reporters are calling every day. Every day they're calling to ask you about something. And so I learned all of that, and by learning those skills, we were able, and as I mentioned, but we were able to increase resources and pass state laws that I think really did, in a macro sense, make a difference. And in working in the mayor's office and the county exec, so city and county government, I really learned about local government is not removed. The phone rings all day long, and it's people calling you about the garbage in front of their house that didn't get picked up. It's not like state government where you're more removed, or the federal government where you're more removed. But at the same time, they care is there good childcare in their community? Are there good community services in their community? And they come and see you. So I learned a lot by working in local government, and I did learn about partnerships and community building, and that we are all in this together, and cities don't have enough money and counties don't have enough money by themselves to solve problems. They need philanthropy and United Way at the table. They need the social service agencies there. They need to know how to communicate with the media. So I learned all those lessons. And in the cabinet, I would say for me, it was very powerful to be able to draw on the knowledge of people like at this campus at Klaus, Joel Rogers and Laura Dresser, and people who are real experts in workforce policy, to help me enrich what we were able to work on and bringing them in as resources. And at the federal government, I would say working cross aisle is hard, but we did try to do it, and those were important lessons. And working with the president's advisors and seeing how hard they work. It's a very intense environment, what goes on in Washington, and I can't say enough about how hard the career people work, as well as the political appointees. People just really work hard, and we did work a lot, in particular, to make reforms to the unemployment insurance system, which was in my portfolio. And then probably one of the most powerful experiences I had, and you all on Tuesday, you saw my slide on this, the Office of National Response was under me. And that's when a state is hit by massive layoffs or a storm, a hurricane, a tornado, a flood. We would provide funds to the state so they could put people who became unemployed through the massive layoff or the storm get back to work, improving the public spaces to put that community back together. So you're helping the community, you're helping those workers have work. And I went to Staten Island with then Secretary of Labor Solis, and I saw the people who had been impacted by Hurricane Sandy and the difference that this program made. And for me, it raises the issue of, and brings home the issue, what is the role of government? You know, when Governor Cuomo came in and asked for more money after Hurricane Sandy, a lot of people in the country, a lot of members in Congress said, that's New York's problem. That's New Jersey's problem. Let them come up with the solution. We in Washington don't have to help them. But a lot of those same people from Texas, now, in the aftermath of the blow-up of the fertilizer plant, they want help from the federal government to help them when a whole town has been blown up and lives lost. So it raises issues about what is the role of government? What is it that macro social workers care about, because it impacts micro social work clients too? I do also want to say I've been very inspired by macro social workers, and Frances Perkins is really the epitome of the macro social worker. This was a woman who started out going to work in Chicago under the umbrella of Jane Addams, and then she went back to New York. And Frances Perkins was, I'm bringing her up because she was the first woman Secretary of Labor at the Department of Labor, and she was FDR's Secretary of Labor. And I'm just going to read you something she said. She was in New York City the day of the very famous Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire 102 years ago. She was there. And 146 immigrant women, because the building, even though it was brand new and it was supposed to be state-of-the-art, they didn't have the OSHA then, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is part of DOL where I worked, which was right next door to me. They didn't have an OSHA then. And so there was a fire in the factory, and the workers were locked in, so they would stay at work. They couldn't get out. And they either burned right in there to death, 146 poor immigrant, mostly women, or they leapt to their deaths from the building. And this had this huge impact on Frances Perkins, and she ended up becoming an advocate for worker safety. She ended up becoming the New York Commissioner of Labor, and she then became FDR's Secretary of Labor. And when she was often asked about what impacted her and how did the New Deal happen, she said the first day of the New Deal was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire Factory. That was the first day of the New Deal, because that experience, which turned her into a safety advocate. And now we have a Department of Labor that has in it OSHA, which is there to make sure that factories and workplaces are safe and people don't lose limbs and arms. And that all started, a lot of this work that's at the Department of Labor now, that I would say was a macro social workers agenda, it started in Wisconsin as a part of the Wisconsin idea. That you had enlightened economists and graduate students and professors at the University of Wisconsin who worked with Fighting Bob LaFollette, who was then the governor. They saw social problems in the early 1900s, and from social problems they knew that you needed macro solutions. And they created workers' compensation. They created the employment service. They created what became Social Security and unemployment insurance. And those programs that started in Wisconsin, that were state programs because government worked with academia from research, like your professor does, from research to craft programs that form solutions in the lives of real people that social workers care about. So it meant a lot to me to be working in that Department of Labor that is called the Francis Perkins Building. The building is called the Francis Perkins Building. And any of you who know Karen Klaus, do you know Karen Klaus, the law professor? A former law professor from UW, Karen was the Solicitor General at the Department of Labor under President Carter, and Karen then after that came here to the University of Wisconsin Law School, and Karen, the highest lawyer, first woman solicitor at DOL, she's the one who led the charge to name the building the Francis Perkins Building. But anyway, that meant a lot to me too. So very, very briefly, the skills that I would say are important to all of you as you go forward. We talked a little bit about this on Tuesday, and I've thought a little bit about it more since then, because Catherine Magnuson said to me, what's important for these young, if they want to go into macro? And I said, budgeting skills are important, and writing skills. You're going to have to write memos. They're not going to, you won't have the luxury of 3 weeks to create them, and they're not going to be 15 pages long. They're going to be 2.5 pages long. And you might get called by the secretary's office or the assistant secretary's office, and you're going to have to come up and make a case for something, or the mayor's office or the county execs or the governor's office, and you're going to have to do it really fast. So you have to have really good, sharp, clear writing skills. So writing's important. And budgeting skills. Everything happens through budgets. The state budget, the city budget, the county budget, the federal budget, they express our values. You have to understand budgets. And the more you can learn about budgets, the better. And the third point I would say for what's important is to just pay attention to our world. Because the more we pay attention to our world, the most effective you will be for your, as I said, whether you're in macro settings or micro settings or macro settings. The more you know, the more effective you're going to be. Yes, you can help people adjust, and you can provide counseling and mental health support to help them do better within this world of poverty they're living in. But after you see 10, 20, 50, 500 people having the same exact problem, it might lead you to step back and think, now wait a minute, I can help that family and that individual. But do we need the earned income tax credit? Do we need to come up with a way to bring more economic stability to low-income people? That's how programs come about. That's how the earned income tax credit came about. It's because people stepped back. So it's a combination of macro and micro that makes the difference. So that's what I will leave you with. And I'm sorry that I went so long, but we have time for probably a question or comment, one or two. Well, I have had, you've heard, I've had many different jobs. I will tell you, I have come across many people, including department heads, who cannot write, who do not write well. And they're writing to the county exec or the mayor. They head up a department. They're making over $115,000 a year. And they're not good writers, and it really hurts their cause and their case and their ask. Yeah, and I don't want to give an unrealistic view. I mean, first of all, when I was a social worker, I certainly applied and went through the civil service, and when it was with the state, and with the personnel systems when it wasn't. When I got hired by the feminist organization, I saw that ad in the newspaper. And I had to apply, and I had to be interviewed, and all of that. when I went to work for the first governor that I worked for, I had to put together a resume and make the case, and they didn't only ask me, I was also putting myself forward for it, so I don't want to misrepresent that. And I would say the same thing with, well, county government, I did get asked, absolutely, to do it. And city government, it was something I was interested in, and I let it be known I was interested, and it kind of turned into a marriage. I would say the same thing for the state job. I first got asked to be a deputy, and kind of the highest level deputy in state government. And I thought about that, and while I was thinking, and I thought maybe I would like to be in the cabinet, not just be a deputy. And one thing led to another, and I became the secretary. The federal government, I did get asked, but then I had to compete, and I wasn't the only. Good to see you. I got asked to throw my hat in the ring, is what I should say. I didn't get, even though I got called and said, "Would you like to be my deputy?" I then had to throw my hat in the ring. I had to be vetted. There were other people who were applying from across the country, so I wasn't the only one. So I would say it's been a mix, and probably I think it's probably the same now, in other words, in the units of government. And I would say that the more people who have seen you in action, the more opportunities you'll have. So if they saw you run a meeting that might have been in your volunteer capacity, they've seen how you do that. Or if they saw an organizational work plan that you put together, which in my case I did, they've seen you do that. Or if they've seen you turn out and manage, a couple hundred volunteers, they know you can do that. So you're kind of, even though in my case it wasn't deliberate or conscious, through the actions you take and the volunteer work you do, it's kind of like the steps of applying for a job in your career along the way. Do you know what I mean? So it might be something you did 2 years ago that got you on their radar, that made them think to call you to even throw your hat in the ring. So, yeah, okay. That's what I would say on that. Yeah, I do think it's gotten very complex right now, and you have news outlets, whether it's Fox News on one side and MSNBC on the other, and they tend to tell the news in line with how they see the news. And they have editorial views that affect the way they tell the story, and we all have to be careful consumers of the news. We have to try and know what the facts are. And I don't think it's easy because there's so much out there, you can just get bombarded, and you don't only want to read what people who think what you think. Someone like me, obviously who I've worked with, I'm a Democrat. If I only pay attention to what Rachel Maddow thinks, I'm not going to be as up on what's going on in the world. And so I think it pays to read a cross-section of news, pay attention to a cross-section of news outlets, and whether it's the Wall Street Journal, and I do think the New York Times is a really good newspaper. Probably some think it's too liberal given their editorial policies, but I think they do a good job in trying to research stories. There's so much competition among them now, and there was just news this week on CNN as they raced to get the Boston story first. They actually told untruths, if you saw that. So they were in such a race to get it out first that they then said, we've got the person.
Even.
Yeah.
News sources are for profit, which I'm pretty sure there used to be some sort of law.
Yeah. So I think you have to just try and I know you don't have endless hours in the day, and you're juggling personal life with school life, and you might have kids or planning a wedding, whatever. It's not easy, but I think we really have to try to get as much news as we can and try and cipher out what's the truth in that. And I did want to tell you all, I told folks on Tuesday, when I was a young policy aide in Governor Earl's office, I'm in my early 30s, and I was the governor's policy advisor on employment and women's issues, this young college graduate came to see me. She was 21 years old. She had just graduated from Smith College. She wanted to work for me. I said, I don't have a budget. She said, I'll intern. I will work for free. I said, great. We're doing pay equity work. I need someone to do research on how women and men are balkanized, where they are in the state workforce, what women are earning, what men or women are earning in female and non-female or male-dominated jobs. I need a lot of research done. She did that work for me. Who was that? That was Tammy Baldwin, right out of college. And she did really wonderful work. She ended up as a young woman then. She applied to law school. She ran for the county board. When I was in county government, I got to watch her in action on the county board. Then she ran for the legislature. We know what happened next. She ran for Congress. This is to inspire you. And then now she's our first woman senator from the state of Wisconsin. So anyway, she had a vision and she knew she wanted that experience, and for her, volunteer work taught her a lot. So good luck to you. You're our change makers of the future. Thank you. Thank you.